Welcome to the deep dive. If you're joining us today, you're probably pretty familiar with how the story of a major historical revolution is supposed to go.
Right, there's a very specific script we expect.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a Hollywood script. We always picture this brave, solitary genius standing on a mountaintop, peering through some rudimentary instrument and boldly shaking their fist at the sky.
Mm-hmm. The ultimate progressive rebel.
Right. Ready to tear down the old suffocating dogmas of religion and just build a brand new rational world from absolute scratch.
And that narrative is incredibly persistent. I mean, we naturally frame these moments as a binary conflict.
Good guys versus bad guys.
Exactly. The enlightened, forward-thinking visionary locked in a battle against a backward, oppressive establishment. It's a very clean, comforting way to view the march of human progress,
Yeah, we want our historical heroes to be like deliberate iconoclasts who knew exactly what kind of modern world they were creating.
But, and this is where it gets really interesting, when you actually step into the granular history of how humanity discovered that the Earth goes around the sun, that entire movie script is just completely thrown out the window.
Oh, absolutely out the window. We are looking at a historical landscape that is fundamentally backward from what we've been taught in, elementary school science classes.
It is the absolute definition of a historical paradox. The reality of the Copernican revolution defies almost every single modern assumption we have about the birth of science.
Which is exactly why today's deep dive is taking us directly into the mind of Nicolaus Copernicus. We're working off a really brilliant and incredibly detailed historical analysis by Sasha Dolenk, which documents the true motivations, the hidden anxieties, and the profound ironies of Copernicus's life.
It's a fascinating source text.
It really is. So our mission today, for you listening, is to unpack this unbelievable irony. The man who stopped the sun and moved the earth did not do it because he was a radical trying to destroy the religious order.
Not at all.
No. He did it out of a deeply conservative, almost reactionary desire to save the old world. He was driven by an intense hatred of ugly math, a total obsession with sound economics, and a quest for divine perfection that, just purely by accident, ended up killing the metaphysical meaning of the entire cosmos.
It's quite the resume.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. We really need to set the scene here, because this story does not start in some quiet, peaceful library with a scholar calmly looking through a telescope.
Far from it. I mean, first of all, telescopes didn't even exist yet.
Oh, right. Good point.
We are dropping right into the end of the year 1496, into the city of Bologna, Italy. And you have to understand that this is a city, and really an entire peninsula, gripped by absolute terror.
Like end-of-the-world vibes.
Very much so. The French army, led by King Charles VIII, has been marching through Italy, just leaving a trail of absolute devastation. But the military threat is really only half the nightmare here.
Because they brought something else with them, right?
Exactly. The soldiers brought something that is inspiring a completely new, unprecedented dread among the population. It's a sudden, horrifying epidemic that the locals are calling the French disease.
Which today we know is...
Syphilis. Yes.
Yeah.
Today we recognize it as the first major outbreak of syphilis in Europe.
And in the late 15th century, a sudden, gruesome plague with absolutely no known cure didn't just cause a medical crisis, right? It caused a massive existential one.
Oh, completely. Society is destabilizing. People are dying in terrifying ways. And naturally, when the ground beneath your feet feels like it's literally collapsing into chaos, you look up.
You look for a pattern.
Right. People were desperate for answers, for some semblance of predictability, so they turned to the stars. Astrology at this time wasn't some fringe hobby or something you read in the back of a magazine.
Right. It wasn't just your daily horoscope.
No, it was the premier crisis management tool of the era.
The psychological weight of that atmosphere is just so crucial for setting the stage for our protagonist. Because amidst all this apocalyptic dread, you have a 23-year-old Nicolaus Copernicus arriving in Bologna.
Just a young guy.
Right. And officially, his uncle, who is this very powerful bishop, has enrolled him at the University of Bologna to study canon law.
Church law.
Yeah. So Copernicus is supposed to be training for a very secure, lucrative, bureaucratic career within the church hierarchy.
That was the plan anyway.
But his real passion, the work that is totally consuming him, is happening entirely off the books after dark. He's spending virtually all of his time living with and acting as the eager assistant to the local astronomy professor, Domenico Maria Novara.
And we should definitely clarify who Novara was in the hierarchy of this society, because when you say astrologer to a modern listener, the immediate image is, a fortune teller in a neon-lit storefront.
Right, crystal balls and tarot cards.
Exactly. But Novara was nothing like that. He was an elite university scholar, he was a highly respected mathematician, and essentially a commanding general in what historians call the War of Astrologers that was just raging across northern Italy at the time.
So he's dealing with some serious math.
Oh, incredibly complex celestial mechanics. Kings, popes, generals, they all relied on figures like Novara to calculate the optimal moments for battles, treaties, or even medical treatments.
High-stakes stuff.
Very high stakes. And it's Novara who first demonstrates to young Copernicus a terrifying professional secret.
The maps are wrong.
Yes, the established astronomical maps, specifically the ancient tables formulated by the Greek-Egyptian astronomer Ptolemy over 1,500 years prior, they're fundamentally failing. The math is just not matching the sky.
And the source material highlights a very specific, undeniable turning point for Copernicus here, right? March 9th, 1497.
That's the date. That night, Copernicus and Novara are standing on a balcony observing the night sky, and they are waiting for an occultation.
Okay, for us non-astronomers, what exactly is an occultation?
Right, so in observational astronomy, an occultation occurs when a larger or closer celestial body passes directly in front of another, hiding it from view, basically an eclipse.
Got it.
So they are specifically waiting for the moon to pass in front of a very bright star in the Taurus constellation called Aldebaran. And this happens to be the very first astronomical observation Copernicus ever formally records.
And from what I understand, the event is just a complete disaster for the credibility of their ancient textbooks.
Oh, a total disaster. The discrepancy was impossible to ignore. Based on the sacred Ptolemaic tables, the moon was supposed to be in one specific position, displaying a specific apparent size based on its calculated distance from Earth.
No, it wasn't.
No. As they watched Aldebaran vanish behind the lunar disk, the timing and the geometry were just glaringly off. To a trained observer, it meant the foundational texts of their entire profession were flawed. The heavens simply were not behaving the way the ancient masters dictated.
Man, that is a massive professional crisis.
Uh-huh.
But the text reveals that the real existential threat to their profession wasn't even coming from bad observational data. It was coming from a completely different direction.
Yes, a devastating philosophical takedown.
Right. Just a few months before Copernicus arrived in Bologna, a local printing press released a massive, highly anticipated 12-book critique. It was titled Disputationes adversus astrologiam divinatricem,
which roughly translates to arguments against divinatory astrology.
Thank you. And it was written by Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who was arguably the most famous and influential Renaissance humanist of the era.
He was a rock star intellectual.
Okay, so wait, I want to make sure I'm grasping the angle of Pico's attack here, because my assumption would be that a critique of astrology would just argue, the stars don't have magic powers.
Right, the modern argument.
Yeah, but Pico's argument was actually that the astronomers themselves were fundamentally incompetent at basic structural math.
That is the brilliance of Pico's critique. He bypassed the theological argument entirely and just went straight for their methodology. Pico publicly points out a massive hypocrisy within the profession.
What was the hypocrisy?
He essentially addresses the astrological community and says, look, you claim you can predict the intricate fate of a human life or the outcome of a massive geopolitical war based on the subtle influences of the planets.
Okay.
Yet, if I ask 3 of your top scholars to tell me the basic physical order of those planets, like whether Venus is situated closer to the sun than Mercury, you literally cannot give me a definitive answer.
Oh, wow. So it's like hiring a mechanic who claims they can perfectly tune your Formula One engine to win a race, but when you open the hood, they can't even point to where the spark plugs are.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
If you don't know the architecture, you can't predict the performance.
That's brilliant.
And at that time, using Ptolemy's geocentric model, where the Earth sits stationary in the center, the calculations for the inner planets had become so messy, so loaded with intersecting arbitrary variables, that the model simply didn't provide a clear, indisputable hierarchy.
It was just a mess.
A total mess. So Pico poses this devastating public question. If the structural order of the heavens is this uncertain and mathematically chaotic, How can anyone possibly trust you to tell us what the position of Mars means for the future of the Republic?
That has to be a mic drop moment for the late 15th century.
Oh, absolutely.
But it also goes much deeper than just roasting their math, right? Because Pico is a humanist. He's the author of the famous oration on the dignity of man. He has a deeper philosophical agenda here.
He does. Pico's ultimate target was the concept of determinism. He violently rejected the idea that human free will, which he saw as the core dignity of mankind, was merely chained to the mechanical, dictatorial movements of the stars.
He wanted humans to be in charge of themselves.
Exactly. He argued that if humans are truly free agents, the sky shouldn't be an opaque, terrifying force of fate that controls us from the shadows. The universe should reflect a rational, understandable, natural order created by a logical God.
So astrology was basically an insult to human dignity.
To Pico, astrology wasn't just scientifically sloppy. It was philosophically toxic.
Yeah.
Because it relied on an unstable, chaotic model of nature to strip humanity of its autonomy.
Okay, so you have young Copernicus. He's brilliant, he's ambitious, and he is standing directly in the middle of this academic wreckage.
The tables he trusts have failed him on the balcony.
Exactly. The leading humanist philosopher of the era has just publicly humiliated his entire field in print. And here's where the story pivots in a way I found completely surprising.
It's totally counterintuitive.
Right, because for Copernicus, Pico's brutal attack was not a reason to throw his hands up, abandon astrology, and just go focus on his canon law degree.
Which is what most people would have done.
Yeah, I would have. But for him, it was a massive, urgent wake-up call to fix the foundation. He realized he needed to repair the underlying astronomy to save the entire discipline.
He wanted to save astrology, not bury it.
Right, but how do you even begin to fix a system that has been broken for a millennium?
To understand his methodology, we really have to completely reframe what truly motivated him. And this is where we run into a massive modern myth about the scientific revolution.
Okay, let's bust the myth.
Today, when we think of scientific breakthroughs, we assume the driving force is always an obsession with new empirical data. We picture scientists demanding better measurements, sharper instruments, more rigorous testing.
Right, we assume progress requires more data points. Just give me more numbers.
But empirical data was not Copernicus's primary drive. What truly motivated him was aesthetics.
Aesthetics, like beauty.
Yes, it was a profound, almost artistic revulsion to the status quo. He looked at the prevailing Ptolemaic system and he hated it, not merely because it miscalculated an occultation by a few degrees, but because the math itself was grotesque. It was fundamentally ugly.
I found this deeply relatable. It's like looking at a massive corporate spreadsheet that technically spits out the correct revenue total at the bottom, but the formulas inside the cells are an absolute nightmare of spaghetti code, circular references, and manual hard-coded overrides.
That is a perfect modern equivalent.
Yeah, the number might be right, but the architecture just feels completely wrong. You can't trust it because the internal logic is so messy.
Right.
To help you listening visualize what the Ptolemaic system was actually like at this point in history, think of a massive antique grandfather clock. It technically chimes at the correct hour, but if you open the back wooden panel and look inside, it's not a set of elegant, smoothly turning proportional gears.
No, it's a disaster in there.
A total disaster. It's full of improvised, hidden cogs of different sizes, extra springs strapped together with wire, and weird little levers that some mechanic jammed in there just to force the hands to jump to the right number at the very last second.
That clock analogy perfectly captures the state of medieval astronomy.
Yeah.
And the biggest, ugliest, most offensive hidden gear inside Ptolemy's grandfather clock was a mathematical concept called the equant.
The equant, the text makes it very clear that this is the absolute villain of our story for Copernicus.
It was the source of his greatest intellectual disgust. And to understand why, we have to break down what an equant actually does.
Okay, walk us through it.
So in the ancient Aristotelian view of physics, which was the absolute gold standard for how reality operated, there was a sacred, unbreakable rule. Heavenly bodies are divine, perfect entities.
Okay.
Therefore, they can only move in perfect circles, and they must move at a constant, unvarying, uniform speed.
Simple, elegant, geometrically divine.
Exactly. The problem is that reality is messy. If you track a planet like Mars across the sky over several months, it does not appear to move at a constant speed.
It changes speeds.
Visually, yes. Sometimes it seems to accelerate, and sometimes it lingers and slows down. Hundreds of years earlier, Ptolemy recognized this observational reality.
So he had a
A
problem.
huge problem. He needed to make his mathematical model match these messy observations, but he was strictly forbidden by Aristotelian physics from abandoning the perfect circle.
He couldn't just say, oh, it's not a circle.
No, that would be heresy.
Yeah.
His solution to this trap was the invention of the equant.
And how exactly did this mathematical cheat work? I mean, how do you keep it on a circle but change the speed?
Right, so the equant is a mathematical point located in empty space.
Yeah.
It is specifically not the center of the planet's circular orbit. It's offset from the center.
Just floating off to the side.
Yes. Ptolemy essentially stated, okay, the planet is moving along a circular path. However, its speed is not constant relative to the center of the circle. Instead, if you imagine standing at this invisible off-center equant point, the planet appears to sweep out equal angles in equal times.
Let me make sure I'm getting this. He's essentially programming a cheat code.
That's exactly what he's doing.
He's saying, look, I promise the planet is on a circle, but to make the math work, we have to pretend it's moving uniformly relative to this totally random imaginary coordinate floating in the dark, rather than the actual center of its own orbit.
That is precisely what it was. It was a mathematical fudge factor designed to simulate acceleration and deceleration, while technically barely keeping the planet on a circular track.
Wow.
And for Copernicus, this was a monstrum, a monster,
A monster.
an absolute betrayal of scientific, philosophical, and theological purity. By utilizing the equant, Ptolemy was quietly abandoning the fundamental premise that the movement of the divine heavens was inherently simple and uniform.
And here is where the historical narrative flips completely upside down for me. Copernicus wasn't trying to invent a new, progressive, modern future. He was looking backward.
He
He was looking at the ancient Greeks and essentially saying, Ptolemy, you sold out. Copernicus was trying to be more traditional than the ancient traditions themselves.
The phrase used in the historical analysis is perfect here. He was more papal than the Pope.
I love that.
Copernicus wanted to strip away all the mechanical hacks, the equants, the hidden gears, and return astronomy to the pure, unadulterated Aristotelian physics of perfect, uniform circles. He wanted a universe that didn't require cheat codes to function.
It's just a profound look into the mindset of a true Renaissance man. To Copernicus, a mathematical cheat wasn't just a pragmatic rounding error, It was a moral failure.
It was an insult to the creator.
Exactly. If the geometry of the heavens wasn't elegant, it meant human reason had been defeated. And you can see this intense, obsessive hatred of fake math spilling over into a totally different, highly practical sphere of his life.
Because he wasn't just an astronomer.
Right. Copernicus was not just a guy staring at the stars in an ivory tower. He had a very demanding, boots-on-the-ground day job.
His professional responsibilities were incredibly grounded. After his studies, Copernicus returned to his native region of Warmia in modern-day Poland and served as a high-level administrator of church lands and financial affairs.
He was a bureaucrat.
He was a deeply practical man dealing with agriculture, diplomacy, and the cold, hard realities of regional economics.
And he was evidently brilliant at it.
Ah.
Long before he published his astronomical theories, he formulated a massive foundational economic principle.
A really famous one.
Yeah. Today, in modern economics, we call it Gresham's Law, named after Thomas Gresham, who lived decades later. But Copernicus wrote it down first. The principle is, bad money drives out good.
And this principle was born directly out of a crisis he had to manage daily. As the economic administrator for Warmia, Copernicus watched local rulers in rival territories constantly debasing their currency to fund wars and jets.
Right.
The process was simple but destructive. A ruler would take pure silver coins, melt them down, mix in cheaper base metals like copper, and then mint new coins, stamping them with the exact same face value as the original pure silver.
And anyone who has lived through an economic crisis knows what happens next. The merchants realize the new coins have less actual silver in them.
Right, they aren't foolish.
So they hoard the pure silver coins, the good money, and they only spend the debased copper-filled coins, the bad money.
Exactly.
Which instantly causes massive inflation, ruins the local markets, and creates total chaos for everyday citizens who are just trying to buy a loaf of bread.
The economic devastation of this drove him entirely crazy. He wrote extensive treatises on the subject, just begging the authorities to centralize the mints and restore the purity of the currency.
He hated the fake money just like he hated the fake math.
Yes, he saw firsthand how corrupting the fundamental unit of value, the coin, destroyed the integrity of the entire social system.
Let's draw a direct line here because I think this is the key to understanding his entire life. To Copernicus, The local economy and the cosmic architecture are the exact same problem.
They really are.
Just like greedy, short-sighted rulers were debasing silver coins and causing market chaos, Ptolemy and the ancient astronomers had debased the geometry of the heavens. Ptolemy's equants were the cheap copper mixed into the pure silver of Aristotelian circles.
That's a great way to put it.
Ptolemy had taken the pure gold standard of divine circular motion and mixed in this fake base metal just to make his ledgers balance. Copernicus wanted to audit the entire universe. He wanted to recall all the bad, debased celestial currency and restore the strict gold standard of divine perfection.
That parallel strikes at the very core of his psychology. He simply could not tolerate systemic disorder, whether it was in his treasury vault or in the night sky. He believed passionately that a perfect, rational God would not create a sloppy, rigged system.
And we must recognize that this quest for order wasn't limited to just intellectual treatises. When the physical order of his world was immediately threatened, he didn't hide behind his desk. He took direct, highly dangerous physical action.
Yes, the text reveals a side of him I had never heard of before. Copernicus, the military commander.
I know, this blew my mind.
During the Polish-Teutonic War, right around 1519 to 1521, the Teutonic Knights, a brutal, highly trained military order, are invading the Warmia region, burning villages and laying siege to fortresses.
And what do the vast majority of the other church officials and canons do? They pack their gold and flee to safety in larger cities.
They ran.
What does our mathematician do?
He refuses to abandon his post. He entrenches himself in the castle at Ulston. With the higher-ranking officials gone, he assumes the de facto role of military commander.
He's literally manning the walls.
He organizes the local guards. He personally oversees the fortification of the castle walls. We have records of his desperate, urgent letters to the Polish king begging for artillery, specifically requesting lead, gunpowder, and supplies.
And he wins, right?
Yes. Through sheer administrative grit and tactical stubbornness, he holds the line. He successfully defends the castle, and the Teutonic siege is eventually broken.
It is an almost surreal image. The exact same man who is staying up until 3:00 a.m. doing complex trigonometry to calculate the orbital nodes of Mars is spending his days on a stone parapet, rationing lead from muskets and calculating the trajectory of incoming cannon fire.
It reveals the absolute unity of his character. He is, at his core, a defender of order repelling the forces of chaos.
Whether that chaos manifests as a horde of Teutonic knights trying to breach his physical walls, skyrocketing inflation threatening to destroy his local economy, or a messy, monstrous astronomical model insulting the intellect of the divine creator.
He's fighting the exact same war on three completely different fronts.
And part of that divine intellect, part of that profound order he was trying to protect, involved his absolute reverence for the sun. We cannot ignore the spiritual and philosophical side of this revolution. Copernicus was heavily influenced by Renaissance Neoplatonism.
Neoplatonism was a really powerful philosophical current during the Renaissance. It blended the classical ideas of Plato with mystical, almost religious elements.
Okay, so how did they view the sun?
In this specific worldview, the sun isn't merely a massive hot rock burning in space. It is the visible, physical manifestation of the highest good.
Like a stand-in for God.
Basically. It represents the ultimate mind, the absolute source of light, reason, and divine order in the material world.
You can really hear this in his writing. In his final famous book, De Revolutionibus, Copernicus basically pauses the dense mathematics to write a philosophical love letter to the sun.
He does.
He asks, quote, "In this most beautiful temple, who would place this lamp in any other or better place than that from which it can illuminate all things at the same time?"
To Copernicus, the sun was the undeniable king of the cosmos. And logically, a king does not run around the outer edges of the kingdom serving his subjects.
Right, the king doesn't do errands.
Exactly. The king must sit stationary on the royal throne in the absolute center of the court, while the subjects, the planets, which must obviously include the Earth, revolve around him in orderly tribute.
So we have thoroughly established his intense drive and his motivations. We know he despises the messy math of the equant, he demands the restoration of perfect Aristotelian circles, and he believes spiritually that the sun deserves to be in the center.
The motive is clear.
But wanting a beautiful theory to be true and actually proving it with rigorous mathematics are two very different challenges. How did he actually solve this massive geometric puzzle that had stumped the greatest minds of humanity for over 1,000 years?
He needed a mathematical breakthrough, right?
Yeah.
A new way of visualizing the geometry, and he found it in a book.
Just randomly.
It was a completely serendipitous discovery during his time in Bologna. In 1496, the exact same year he arrived in Italy, a highly technical book was printed in Venice. It was titled Epitome in Almagestum Ptolemy.
The epitome of Ptolemy's Almagest.
Correct. It was authored by a brilliant German mathematician named Johannes Regiomontanus, expanding on the work of his teacher, Georg von Feuerbach.
Okay.
Now, Regiomontanus had actually been dead for 20 years by the time it was published, but his insights were about to fundamentally change the world. This book wasn't just a basic summary of ancient astronomy, it was a critical, high-level, cutting-edge commentary.
So it's advanced stuff.
Very advanced. And tucked away deep in the later chapters was a complex geometric proof that, to an untrained eye, looked like an obscure technical footnote.
But to Copernicus, looking for a way to fix the ugly math, it was the skeleton key to the universe. What exactly did this footnote prove?
Regiomontanus mathematically proved that the two primary geometric components used by Ptolemy to track planetary motion specifically, circles called deferents and epicycles, could be swapped with one another without changing the final visual result that an observer sees in the night sky.
Okay, we really need to unpack this visually for everyone listening because this is the absolute aha moment of the entire deep dive. In the old Ptolemaic system, how did they explain the path of a planet?
Right, let's visualize it. Imagine you are drawing a very large circle, and the Earth is sitting perfectly still right in the middle of it.
Okay, at my big circle.
That large primary circle is called the deferent. Now take a much smaller circle and attach its center point to the edge of the large circle.
So a little circle riding on the edge of the big circle.
Yes. That smaller secondary circle is the epicycle.
It's essentially the mechanics of a teacup ride at an amusement park.
Exactly.
The massive platform on the ground is spinning. That's the large deferent. But the individual teacup you are sitting in is also spinning in its own smaller circle on top of the platform. That's the epicycle.
That is an excellent way to visualize it. Ptolemy theorized that the planets are riding inside the teacup while the entire platform rotates around the Earth.
Why do they need such a complicated ride?
This combination of two simultaneous circular motions was necessary to explain a strange phenomenon called retrograde motion.
Retrograde motion.
Right. Occasionally, planets like Mars appear to stop in the sky, move backward for a few weeks, and then proceed forward again.
Which is super weird to watch.
It is. Ptolemy explained this by saying that when the little circle, the teacup, spins backward relative to the forward motion of the big circle, the planet, briefly appears to reverse course from our perspective on Earth.
And it worked, mathematically speaking. It predicted where the planets would be.
It did function as a predictive tool. But the proof from Regiomontanus offered a fascinating geometric alternative. He proved a theorem stating that you can mathematically swap the properties of the deferent and the epicycle.
Swap them.
Yes. You can trade their sizes and the speeds at which they rotate, and geometrically, the planet will end up in the exact same mathematical position in the sky.
So, extending the analogy, you could make the teacup the size of the entire platform and shrink the platform down to the size of a teacup, and mathematically, the complex path the ride traces out looks exactly the same to someone watching from the stands.
Precisely. Now, for the vast majority of astronomers reading Regiomontanus, this was just an elegant geometric trick, a neat thought experiment.
Just nerding out over math.
Exactly. But Copernicus, with his intense obsession for systemic order, noticed something deeply, suspiciously coincidental about Ptolemy's specific measurements for the outer planets: Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn.
What was the suspicious coincidence?
In Ptolemy's geocentric model, every single one of those outer planets possessed an epicycle, a teacup, that completed exactly one full rotation in precisely one Earth year.
Let me pause right there. Mars takes almost 2 Earth years to complete its orbit, right? Jupiter takes 12 years. Saturn takes nearly 30 years to journey across the zodiac. But you're saying that Ptolemy had to program a secret, arbitrary, exactly 1-year cycle into the mathematical path of every single one of those drastically different planets just to make his Earth-centered math work.
He absolutely did. Ptolemy and everyone who followed him simply accepted this as a bizarre quirk of nature, a cosmic coincidence.
Just one of those things.
Right. But Copernicus looked at that data and immediately knew it was a systemic flaw. He asked the defining question: Why do three completely independent, vastly different planets all share a hidden, identical cycle that exactly matches the apparent movement of the sun around the Earth?
And here's the stroke of absolute history-altering genius. Copernicus takes that mathematical trick he learned from Regiomontanus, the geometric swap.
He executes the swap on paper. For Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, he geometrically trades the roles, sizes, and speeds of their deferents and epicycles.
And what happened?
The moment he performs this calculation, something miraculous emerges from the math. Those three separate, mysterious, arbitrary one-year epicycles do not just sit there as isolated anomalies. Because they possess the exact same one-year period, they suddenly merge.
They merged together.
Yes, they geometrically lock together into a single, shared, unifying circle.
And if you place the sun in the stationary center of this new model, what is that one shared one-year circle that perfectly connects the math of all the outer planets?
It is the physical orbit of the Earth.
The math literally builds the Earth's orbit out of the hidden anomalies of the other planets. That is insane.
It is a moment of breathtaking geometric inevitability. Copernicus didn't just wake up one morning and randomly guess that the Earth moved. The geometry forced his hand.
It told him the answer.
Right. By shifting the Earth out of the stationary center and transforming it into a moving planet orbiting the sun, the bizarre, unexplained backward loops of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn were instantly, elegantly explained.
Because they weren't actually doing loops.
Exactly. They weren't moving backward on complex teacup rides.
Well,
We on Earth were simply passing them on a faster inside track, causing an optical illusion. Much like a faster race car, passing a slower one on a track makes the slower car appear to move backward for a brief moment.
it is so incredibly elegant. He eliminated the sloppy coincidences. He audited the math and found the hidden truth.
He really did.
But let me push back on this for a second, because if I'm living in the early 1500s and you pitch this unified theory to me, it sounds absolutely certifiably insane.
Oh, completely crazy to them.
If the Earth is a massive sphere of rock and water spinning at breakneck speed, whipping around the sun through the void, why do I not feel it? Why do birds not get violently blown out of the sky the second they leave a branch?
The headwind argument.
Yeah, why do stones, when you drop them straight down from a high tower, not land miles to the west as the Earth violently spins beneath them? Why are we not all permanently leaning into a supersonic headwind?
The physical objections you're raising are exactly the arguments Copernicus faced from the common sense philosophy of his era. And the historical truth is startling here. Copernicus had absolutely no physical answer to those questions.
None at all. He couldn't explain why we don't feel the motion.
He had no scientific mechanism to explain it. The concepts of physics required to explain inertia, gravitational frames of reference, and relative motion, the underlying reasons why we do not feel a constant velocity, those wouldn't be theorized or proven until Galilei and Isaac Newton arrived centuries later.
So he's flying blind physically.
He was going up against the undeniable, unquestionable, everyday testimony of human senses, and he was armed with absolutely nothing but pure geometry.
He is basically looking his contemporaries in the eye and saying, look, I know you can feel the solid ground standing absolutely still beneath your boots. I know you can literally watch the sun rise in the east and set in the west with your own two eyes, but your eyes are lying to you.
That is the radical philosophical leap he made. He determined that mathematical elegance was a higher form of truth than physical observation. He effectively declared, our math is smarter than our eyes.
That takes some serious confidence.
It does. And to understand how disruptive this was, you have to look at the strict division of labor in medieval universities.
Yeah.
At that time, the physicists and the natural philosophers were the ones who dictated what physical reality actually was.
And the astronomers.
The astronomers were viewed merely as applied mathematicians. They were essentially human calculators. Their geometric models were seen as useful fictions, just complex tools to predict where a point of light would appear in the sky, not descriptions of actual physical truth.
But Copernicus fundamentally crosses that academic boundary. He says, no, if the geometry is this perfect, this mathematically necessary to unify the system, then it cannot be a fiction. It must be physically real. The Earth is actually physically hurtling through space.
He elevated mathematics to the language of nature.
He did. But introducing a theory this physically counterintuitive and potentially this theologically heretical required an incredibly sophisticated public relations strategy, especially when dealing with the Catholic Church, which wielded ultimate authority over intellectual and scientific life in Europe.
Yes. But luckily for Copernicus, he didn't have to invent a reason to publish his work. The perfect excuse arrives straight from the highest levels of the Vatican.
Right on time.
In 1514, the Catholic Church convened the Fifth Lateran Council. They were facing a massive, systemic, structural problem that was threatening the rhythm of the entire Christian world.
The calendar was broken.
The Julian calendar, which Europe had been relying on since the days of the Roman Empire, was fundamentally broken. It was slightly, almost imperceptibly, out of sync with the actual solar year.
But over 1,500 years, those tiny fractions of a day compound into a massive scheduling error.
Exactly. And the most critical consequence was the scheduling of Easter. Easter is the most sacred date in the Christian calendar, and its timing is strictly tied to the spring equinox and the lunar cycle.
So if the calendar drifts,
Because the calendar was drifting, Easter was sliding completely out of its proper season. It was drifting dangerously close to the summer months. The entire liturgical rhythm of fasts and feasts was falling apart.
so the Pope was panicking.
In a panic, Pope Leo X sent out a formal decree, begging the greatest theologians, mathematicians, and astronomers in Europe to help the Church fix the calendar.
And Copernicus, sitting in his castle in Poland, is one of the scholars who responds to the Pope's call. But his response is a masterclass in strategic framing.
It really was.
He essentially writes back and says, "Holy Father, I am completely devoted to helping fix the calendar. However, it is structurally impossible for us to fix the calendar until we possess a mathematically perfect map of the motions of the sun and the moon. And right now, as you know, our maps are a chaotic mess."
It was an act of brilliant political maneuvering. It provided Copernicus with the ultimate unimpeachable alibi.
His cover story.
Exactly. Remember, he had been quietly, secretly working on this potentially dangerous heliocentric idea for years. Now his decades of lonely, subversive stargazing and radical math were officially framed as a pious Orthodox mission to save the Christian liturgical calendar.
He's doing it for God.
He genuinely deeply believed that the Pope would eventually welcome his final manuscript, not as a challenge to religious dogma, but as a wholly necessary tool for the Church.
But this brings us to what the source material identifies as the great philosophical tragedy of the Copernican revolution. We've established that Copernicus was a conservative. He wanted to save the perfection of the cosmos. He wanted to save the legitimacy of astrology by cleaning up its math.
Right.
But in the process of saving the math, he accidentally destroyed the entire spiritual and metaphysical foundation of his own world.
To grasp the magnitude of this tragedy, we must look at how a medieval person fundamentally viewed existence. Their entire psychological and spiritual framework relied on a strict, vertical, spatial separation. The universe was cleanly divided into two realms, the above and the below.
Let's really paint this picture for you listening, because it is so different from how we view space today.
The above, comprising the heavens, the stars, the moon, and the planets, was considered the literal, physical, divine realm. It was believed to be made of a perfect, weightless, incorruptible element called ether.
Untouchable perfection.
Exactly. It was eternal, unchanging, immortal, and purely spiritual.
And the below. What was the Earth in this framework?
The below was the Earth. Yes, it was the center of the universe geographically, but philosophically it was the bottom of the cosmic sink. It was the realm where all heavy, gross matter settled.
The garbage dump.
Sort of, yes. It was a domain of change, of decay, of corruption, and of death. The entire logic of medieval theology, and specifically the logic of astrology, depended entirely on this stark contrast.
So the pure above shines down on the dirty below.
Exactly. The perfect divine above radiated its spiritual influence down onto the corrupt, passive, decaying below. The stars and planets mattered precisely because they were profoundly other. They were untouchable and fundamentally different from the dirt we walk on.
So consider the catastrophic philosophical implications of what Copernicus does. In his quest to make the geometry perfect, he takes the Earth, this heavy, dirty, decaying rock of mortality, and he violently ejects it out of the cosmic basement.
He shoots it right into the sky.
He shoots the Earth up into the heavens, making it orbit the sun in the exact same space as Mars or Jupiter.
He transforms the Earth into a planet, just another rock moving through the sky. And by doing that, he instantly and permanently erased the ancient duality.
There's no more above and below.
Right. If the Earth is suddenly up in the sky, then there is no longer a below. And if we are all up in the heavens together, swirling around the sun, what makes the heavens divine anymore?
Wow, right.
Why should the movements of Mars have any mystical or spiritual influence on the fate of an earthly king, any more than the Earth influences the rocks on Mars?
It's devastating to his original goal. He solved the mathematical puzzle. He successfully created the perfect, harmonic, geometric order he had obsessed over his entire life. But the cost was immense. He accidentally killed the metaphysical meaning of the entire universe.
That is the supreme irony of his life. The cosmos he built was mathematically flawless, yes, but suddenly it was totally cold. It was empty. It was a purely mechanical system operating by blind geometry rather than radiating divine grace.
It lost its magic.
It became totally indifferent to humanity. Copernicus sought to bring human understanding closer to God's flawless intellect, but instead he initiated the slow, inexorable process that made the modern universe feel vast, lonely, and devoid of inherent human meaning.
And you have to wonder if on some deep subconscious level, he sensed how disruptive and alienating this new reality was going to be. Because despite having his math totally locked in, and despite having that incredibly protective alibi of fixing the calendar for the Pope, Copernicus sat on his finished manuscript for decades.
He held on to it for a very long time.
He absolutely refused to publish it. Why? Was he terrified of the Inquisition? Was he having nightmares about being burned at the stake for heresy?
That is another pervasive historical myth we need to correct. In the early to mid-1500s, the Catholic Church had not yet drawn a hard institutional line against heliocentrism. The infamous Galileo affair, complete with the Inquisition trials and the threat of torture, was still a full century away.
Oh, really? So he wasn't worried about the stake?
No, Copernicus was a highly respected, high-ranking church official in good standing. His primary fear was not the executioner's stake. His primary paralyzing fear was being publicly mocked.
He was a brilliant scholar, terrified of looking stupid.
Essentially, yes. He was deeply afraid of being laughed out of the room by people who didn't possess the mathematical literacy to understand the complex geometry he had spent his life perfecting.
The haters.
The haters, exactly.
Yeah.
In the preface to his grand work, De Revolutionibus, he states very defensively, quote, "Mathematics is written for mathematicians."
Basically saying, if you don't get the math, shut up.
That's the subtext. He was petrified that what he called empty heads people, armed with nothing but everyday common sense and strict biblical literalism, would tear his life's work apart without understanding a single equation.
And looking at the historical record, his fears were completely justified, because even before he officially sent his book to the presses, rumors of his radical sun-centered theory were leaking out across Europe, and the intellectual heavyweights of the era were already sharpening their knives.
Word got out.
It did. We actually have a documented quote from Martin Luther, the explosive founder of the Protestant Reformation. In 1539, Luther is sitting around a dinner table with his students, and he complains about the rumors of this new astrologer up in Poland. Luther explicitly says, quote, "This fool wants to turn the whole art of astronomy upside down."
This fool. That is the exact word Copernicus dreaded most. For the leading theological and cultural minds of the era, Copernicus wasn't a dangerous heretic who threatened the fabric of faith. He was simply a crank.
An idiot.
Right. He was an idiot who didn't understand the most basic laws of physics. And because of this intense, paralyzing fear of looking foolish, Copernicus fiercely guarded his work. For years, he only circulated a tiny, handwritten summary called the Commentariolus to a very select, tightly vetted inner circle of trusted academic friends.
Which brings us to one of the most fascinating historical detective stories I've ever come across, detailed right here in the source material. It is a discovery made centuries later by a renowned astronomical historian named Owen Gingerich.
Gingerich did some amazing work.
He wrote a brilliant book called The Book Nobody Read, detailing his decades-long quest to track down and examine every surviving original first edition copy of Copernicus's book scattered across the globe.
Gingerich's archival work was phenomenal, and during his research, he gained access to Copernicus's original, handwritten working manuscript, the actual paper Copernicus wrote on.
And what did he find?
Gingerich found something incredible hidden in the early drafts. Copernicus had originally included a prominent passage that explicitly credited an ancient Greek astronomer named Aristarchus of Samos.
Aristarchus?
Yes. Aristarchus lived in the 3rd century BC, and he had actually proposed a primitive sun-centered universe with a moving Earth almost 2,000 years before Copernicus ever looked through a window in Bologna.
But when Gingerich closely examined the final draft, the actual pages that were bundled up and sent to the printer in Nuremberg, Copernicus had personally taken a pen and violently crossed out the entire section mentioning Aristarchus.
He erased him.
He deliberately manually erased his only intellectual ancestor from the historical record.
It is a stunning editorial decision, and it really raises profound questions about Copernicus's character and his state of mind.
Why erase him?
Well, Gingerich speculates there could be a few intertwined reasons. One possibility is standard Renaissance vanity. The intellectual culture of the time highly prized absolute singular originality.
He wanted all the credit.
Exactly. Perhaps Copernicus, after dedicating his entire adult life and risking his reputation on this immense mathematical proof, wanted to stand alone on the pedestal as the sole author of this new cosmos. He simply didn't want to share the glory with a half-forgotten philosopher from antiquity.
But the alternative theory is much darker, and it ties directly into his overwhelming fear of mockery and backlash, right?
Yes, the survivalist theory. Aristarchus, in his own ancient time, was heavily criticized and formally accused of impiety by his fellow Greeks for suggesting that the earth, which they considered the sacred hearth of the gods, actually moved.
Ah, so he had baggage.
A lot of baggage. Copernicus, who we know was already terrified of being labeled a fool or a heretic, likely knew this history. He might have realized that linking his fragile, highly controversial brand-new theory to a known, historically condemned ancient troublemaker was terrible public relations.
Guilt by association.
Precisely. So, whether driven by immense ego or pure calculated self-preservation, he literally crossed his predecessor out of the narrative.
So we are left with this really poignant image. A brilliant, terrified, aging man sitting in a cold castle in Poland, obsessively hoarding his explosive manuscript, terrified of the world's reaction. If he had been left entirely to his own devices, he almost certainly would have taken the secret of the solar system to his grave.
He probably would have.
It took the arrival of a young, radical, fearless outsider to finally crash into his quiet life and force him to share his universe with the world.
Enter Georg Joachim Ridicus. The year is 1539. Ridicus is a young, fiery, incredibly brilliant mathematician. And crucially, he's a Protestant hailing from the University of Wittenberg, which is the absolute epicenter of Martin Luther's religious reformation.
And this young Protestant decides to travel hundreds of miles deep into staunchly Catholic territory, right into Copernicus's backyard in Warmia.
You really cannot overstate how incredibly dangerous that journey was. The religious wars between Catholics and Protestants were boiling over across Europe. People were being executed for far less.
He just shows up.
A prominent Protestant academic traveling uninvited into a fortified Catholic stronghold was risking his freedom, his career, and quite possibly his life. But Ridicus is utterly feverishly obsessed with the whispered rumors of Copernicus's mathematical breakthroughs. He risks everything and shows up completely unannounced on the old master's doorstep.
I can just imagine the scene. Copernicus, this cautious, secretive, elderly canon who has spent decades hiding his work, opens his door to find this buzzing 25-year-old Protestant fanboy standing there demanding to see the math.
It must have been a profound shock. But Ridicus's sheer enthusiasm and genuine mathematical brilliance somehow broke through Copernicus's paranoid defenses. Ridicus essentially moves in.
He just stays there.
For 2 entire years.
Right.
He acts as Copernicus's sole, devoted disciple. He lives with him. He tirelessly copies out massive, mind-numbing tables of astronomical data by hand. And most importantly, he acts as his psychological anchor.
The hype man.
He relentlessly pushes, flatters, reassures, and persuades the hesitant, terrified master to finally prepare his life's work for proper, formal publication.
Ridicus is the absolute hero we didn't know the scientific revolution needed. He finally gets the manuscript organized, secures Copernicus's blessing, and takes it off to the printing presses in Nuremberg. It is happening. The revolution is finally going to print.
Finally.
But then, at the 11th hour, we get an agonizing historical twist.
Yes. Ridicus, unfortunately, cannot stay in Nuremberg to oversee the agonizingly slow printing process. He is appointed to a new academic post and has to leave town. So he leaves the final supervision and proofreading of the monumental text to a local man named Andreas Osiander.
Osiander. If the equant was the mathematical villain, Osiander is the human villain of our story.
Well, Osiander's motivations are debated, but his actions are clear. Osiander was a very prominent, influential Lutheran theologian. And as he sits in the printing house reading the final proofs of Copernicus's book, he gets massive cold feet.
He panics.
He looks at this dense, complex work, asserting that the massive Earth actually physically hurtles through space, and his theological panic sets in. He thinks this is entirely too radical. It contradicts Scripture. The theologians will immediately ban it, and the philosophers will laugh it out of existence.
So what does he do to mitigate the damage? Because he commits what has to be the ultimate editorial betrayal in the history of science.
Behind Copernicus's back, completely without asking permission or notifying the author, Osiander writes his own preface to the book. and he instructs the printer to insert it right at the very beginning of the text, completely unsigned.
So everyone thinks Copernicus wrote it.
Exactly. To any reader opening the book, it appears as though Copernicus himself wrote it.
And what exactly did this fake, unauthorized preface say?
It essentially said, "Dear reader, please do not be alarmed by the contents of this book. The author does not actually believe the Earth moves. These heliocentric models are not meant to be taken as literal physical truth.
Oh my God.
They are merely a calculating aid. They are a convenient mathematical fiction designed strictly to make it easier for astronomers to predict where the planets will appear in the sky. Absolutely nobody's claiming this reflects physical reality."
It is enraging. Osiander completely neutered the life's work of a genius. He slapped a massive "just kidding" sticker on the front page of the greatest scientific achievement of the millennium.
To understand why this is so tragic, we have to connect it back to the academic boundaries we discussed earlier. Osiander was forcefully shoving Copernicus back into that restrictive medieval box.
Back to just being a calculator.
Right. He was enforcing the old, rigid division of labor. Astronomers just do the math. They do not dictate physical reality. Osiander almost certainly thought he was doing Copernicus a massive favor. He believed he was protecting the old man from theological backlash and censorship.
But he ruined the whole point.
In doing so, he entirely gutted the philosophical core of Copernicus's existence. Copernicus profoundly, deeply believed that his perfect geometry proved the actual physical reality of the universe.
It sets up this incredibly tragic, almost cinematic final image of Copernicus's life. The year is 1543. Copernicus is lying on his deathbed. He's recently suffered a severe stroke. He is paralyzed, slipping in and out of consciousness.
He's right at the end.
And a messenger finally arrives from Nuremberg, rushing into the bedchamber, and places the very first freshly printed, bound copy of De Revolutionibus into Copernicus's trembling hands.
It's the physical culmination of his entire existence on Earth. But he's far too weak to open the cover. He's too weak to read the pages.
He doesn't even know.
He dies mere hours later, completely unaware that his life's pursuit of absolute divine truth has been packaged, altered, and sold to the world, with the cowardly theological disclaimer claiming it is all just a mathematical illusion.
He dies thinking his pure Aristotelian circles are safe. He dies believing he successfully defended the divine geometry of the heavens against the chaos of the equant. But the revolution he started had a life of its own, right? Once that sun-centered math was unleashed into the world, it acted like a virus.
A mathematical virus, yes.
And it was about to mutate and completely destroy the very sacred belief he had fought so hard to protect.
To witness the final act of this revolution, we have to jump forward about 50 years. We leave the deathbed of Copernicus, and we enter the era of Johannes Kepler.
Kepler, the spiritual successor.
Kepler is, in almost every meaningful way, Copernicus's truest spiritual heir. Unlike the scholars who bought into Osiander's fake preface, Kepler read the math and believed the Copernican model was physically real. He fully, passionately embraced the sun-centered universe.
But Kepler possessed something Copernicus never had. He had the receipts. He had access to the most mind-bendingly accurate, comprehensive astronomical observations ever recorded in human history.
Right, the data from Tycho Brahe.
Exactly. Painstakingly compiled by his brilliant, eccentric boss, the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe.
Brahe's data was completely unprecedented. Long before the invention of the telescope, Brahe had built massive, specialized sighting instruments and mapped the precise movements of the planets night after night for decades with a margin of error that was practically zero.
Just naked eye observations, but perfect.
Incredibly precise. When Brahe died, Kepler inherited this massive, intimidating mountain of raw data. And Kepler's goal was simple and pure. He was going to take Brahe's flawless empirical data, and he was going to lay it perfectly over Copernicus's flawless sun-centered circles and prove once and for all to the entire world that the system was divine.
But when he runs the numbers, it doesn't fit.
It fundamentally does not fit. And the biggest troublemaker, the planet that absolutely refuses to cooperate with the math, is Mars.
Mars, the god of war.
Very fittingly. Kepler spent 8 agonizing, obsessive years trying to make the physical orbit of Mars fit perfectly into a Copernican circle. He literally referred to this period in his journals as his war with Mars.
8 years on one planet.
He tweaked the center points. He adjusted the orbital speeds. He tried every complex mathematical trick he could possibly conceive of. And sometimes he'd get incredibly close. He would build a model that almost worked perfectly, but it would be off by just 8 arc minutes when compared to Brahe's physical data.
We need context for that measurement. 8 arc minutes is a tiny, microscopic sliver of the night sky. It is barely visible to the naked eye. I feel like most pragmatic people would have just looked at that and said, close enough, round it down, print the book, and let's go get a drink.
A lesser mind absolutely would have.
Yeah.
But Kepler was a fanatic for the absolute truth of the empirical data. He refused to ignore or round away those 8 arc minutes. He realized, with growing dread, that the data was trying to tell him something that violated the oldest, most sacred rule in human history.
The circle.
Yes. No matter how violently he forced the math, the actual physical orbit of Mars simply refused to be a perfect circle.
So Kepler is faced with an impossible choice. And he does the unthinkable. He takes the one thing Copernicus was desperately trying to save, the perfect, divine, Aristotelian circle, and he has to shatter it.
He permanently abandons the circle. He mathematically realizes that Mars is actually moving in an elongated, stretched-out shape, an ellipse.
And how did he feel about that?
For Kepler, this was a moment of profound aesthetic and spiritual disgust. He was a Neoplatonist, just like Copernicus. He loved divine symmetry and perfection. When the math undeniably proved the orbit was an ellipse, he famously and disgustedly referred to the shape in his writings as a cart of dung.
A cart of dung. He discovers the actual physical truth of the solar system, and he's furious because he thinks it's ugly.
But the philosophical collapse gets even worse. Because once you are forced by the data to accept the ellipse, the second sacred pillar of ancient physics instantly collapses as well. Planets don't just move in non-circular paths, they absolutely do not move at constant uniform speeds.
Because of the shape of the ellipse.
Right. Kepler realizes through the math that as a planet gets closer to the sun in its elliptical orbit, the gravitational pull, though he didn't possess the vocabulary to call it gravity yet, whips the planet around much faster. And as it swings further away from the sun, it significantly slows down.
The two holiest, unbreakable rules of ancient science, the perfect circle and the constant uniform speed, both fall completely to pieces at exactly the same time.
This is the exact moment. This is the true, definitive birth of modern science as we understand it. Because for the very first time in human history, hard empirical data forces humanity to accept a mathematical truth that absolutely no ancient authority, no Greek philosopher, and no religious text had ever suggested or sanctioned.
The universe doesn't care about our feelings.
Exactly. The universe, it turns out, is not obligated to conform to human ideas of beauty or symmetry or divine perfection. It operates strictly on its own gritty physical reality, whether we find it aesthetically pleasing or not.
So let me trace the logic of this entire paradox, just to make sure the sheer irony is perfectly clear for everyone listening. In his obsessive, profoundly conservative attempt to save the sacred perfect circles, and in his quest to get rid of Ptolemy's sloppy, ugly equants, Copernicus inadvertently created the very sun-centered mathematical framework that eventually allowed Kepler to prove that perfect circles didn't exist at all.
That is the perfect summary. Copernicus unleashed a mechanical logic that entirely outgrew his own philosophy. He built a magnificent theoretical machine specifically designed to save the old world, and the machine he built destroyed it.
That is an unbelievable, almost Shakespearean historical irony. So as we wrap up this incredibly deep dive into the source material, how do we ultimately make sense of the Copernican legacy? What is the final, overarching takeaway for us today?
I think the historian Saxo Delank hits the nail on the head when he concludes his analysis by quoting the great German writer and philosopher Johann Wolfgang von Goethe.
What did Goethe say?
Goethe observed that perhaps no single discovery in history had a greater, more disruptive impact on the human spirit than this one. Because Copernicus, whether he intended to or not, asked humanity to give up something incredibly precious and deeply comforting: the immense, ego-driven privilege of being the absolute center of the universe.
He permanently demoted us. He made us just another rock.
He did demote our physical status. But think carefully about what he gave us in return. Copernicus couldn't physically see the new universe he was proposing. Telescopes didn't exist to prove stellar parallax or observe the phases of Venus.
He just had his math.
He had to entirely trust his internal mind's eye, his rational intellect, over the obvious screaming sensory reality of the solid ground beneath his feet. He took away our physical centrality in the cosmos, yes, but he proved that the human mind has the astonishing capacity to calculate its own physical insignificance.
Wow.
And that is a bizarre, beautiful, almost terrifying superpower that defines the modern age.
It completely flips the script of the hero's journey, which brings me right back to the premise we started with. We talked about how much we love the movie version of history, the clean, simple rebellion, The obvious forward-thinking hero fighting the obvious backward dogma.
The easy narrative.
Right.
But the messy reality of the Copernican revolution shows us that the biggest, most profound leaps forward often require us to fight our own obvious realities. Copernicus had to wage a war against the absolute truth of his daily physical experience, the unmoving, heavy dirt under his boots, the undeniable sight of the sun rising in the east and setting in the west to discover the actual hidden truth of the cosmos.
To find the truth, he had to rebel against his own senses.
And that is exactly what I want to leave you with, to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. We sit here today, over 500 years later, feeling very smug and scientifically enlightened that we know the Earth moves around the sun. We think we have the basic architecture of reality all figured out. But if the absolutely solid, unmoving ground beneath Copernicus's feet turned out to be a total mathematical illusion, what obvious, unquestionable truth of your own daily experience are you entirely blind to right now, simply because the math or the data hasn't yet forced you to see it?
A phenomenal and deeply unsettling question to leave on. Thank you all for exploring this incredible historical paradox with us. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the ground you walk on. We'll see you next time.